So at this point you should at least be familiar with what an externality is, and the point of this video is to go a little bit deeper into how an externality affects a market, how we can represent that with a graph, and then what this says about the implications for how much or how little of a good we should produce, given that there is an externality that is associated with producing or consuming it. So that's a lot of words, and I didn't even write anything down, so now we're going to start writing stuff down and kind of get down to some pictures that will hopefully make all of that a lot clearer. So to start with, we're going to go right back to probably the first thing that you learned in economics, just a simple supply and demand diagram. And it looks simple, but this is going to get not so simple really quickly. So the difference here is that I wrote S sub P, and what this P right here stands for is private. So we learned that the supply curve is really the marginal cost curve above the either average variable cost in the short run or average total cost in the long run. So rather than labeling this private supply, we could really call this private cost. So I'm just going to call this marginal cost, and I'll put a P here, and I guess I'll write out private. So if there's a negative externality though, remember this means that there is a cost to someone not involved. So I'm just going to write a cost to someone else that is not taken into account in this graph right here, and that's why I wrote this private. So I wrote that this was marginal cost sub private, or marginal cost to the company, because this is not taking into account the negative externality, the cost to someone else. So if we do take into account that cost, we're going to have to increase this marginal cost here. And that looks like a decrease in supply. So this, I want to reiterate, this marginal cost sub private, that's the same thing as supply, the private supply. And now we want to take into account this negative externality. We want to say, what does this do to the market? So this is going to obviously shift supply up or to the left, however you like to look at it. To me, it makes more sense to talk about up because that means that costs are increasing. And so this, then, we're going to call this our marginal cost for the society. And some people call it total cost. But then that's confusing with what we normally call total cost for the firm. So I'm going to call this the societal cost, and the other way we could write this is supply for the total society. So if there is a negative externality, what happens without any regulation? Without any regulation, we're at point A, and that would be producing Q sub A and charging price of P, I'll put P to the A. Now, if we take into account this externality, we force this firm to account for the externality, then its costs are going to go up. Its costs are going to go up, just like we showed right here, and I'll kind of extend this arrow up even a little more, just to make it clearer. And that obviously we can see just from kind of the simple supply and demand diagram, that is going to lead to a decrease in quantity produced. So this will be, we'll call this point B, and we'll call this quantity B and price B. So with no intervention, no regulation whatsoever, the market will produce Q sub A and charge P sub A. Now, if the market is regulated to internalize or take into account for the externality, then that cost will be imposed back on the producers of this good. And they will be forced to bear that cost, which will decrease their supply and will lead to a lower quantity produced and a higher price being charged. So just to reiterate, and I'm going to kind of bring this back down to earth with an example really quickly. So a negative externality, and I'm going to erase this because hopefully we're all on the same page now, means that if unregulated, I guess I'll write this down at the bottom. So if unregulated equilibrium, and I'm not going to write out equilibrium, I'm just going to say that quantity produced, or quantity will be greater than the optimal quantity. So the quantity, this is the quantity produced, and that will be greater than the optimal quantity, the quantity, the Q star, which is optimal. And the price in charged, or the price in the market, I'll just write charged, will be less than the optimal price, which is if the externality is internalized. And this is optimal. So let's bring this back down to earth now with an example. So let's say that a factory produces bricks. And to do this, they have to fire their bricks. So they take in some clay and they form it into a brick, and then they fire it. And when they fire those bricks, it produces a ton of smoke that makes the rest of the land around them unlivable. So let's say that there are a ton of families living around this factory. The factory doesn't have to pay them for all of the smoke that it produces. So this line right here, this is the line that represents the cost to the factory of producing those bricks. This line is the cost of the clay, it's the cost of the land, it's the cost of hiring those workers, it's the cost of getting the fuel to run that fire. It's all of that. But it is not, and this is the key part right here, this is not the cost of the pollution, of the smoke. So the amount of the externality is this distance right here from, you know what, let me make that even clearer. So we'll call this at point A, we'll call this, if we go directly up, we'll make that point C. And the externality is this difference right here. So the externality is the difference from C to A. So I'll just write that as C minus A. And it's the horizontal distance. So really, it's like P sub A minus this up here, which we'll just call this C because it's never really a price that is charged. So the externality would be C minus, and I'm going to have to erase just a little bit, sorry, would be C minus P to the A. That would be the cost of the smoke in this example. So the cost of the smoke now, we have an actual quantity for it, is this much, and that would be like $10, $100, $1,000. I'm not going to quantify it here in this example. And so if the factory is forced to bear that cost, they're forced to either clean up their smoke, or they're forced to help all of the people move away from the smoke. If they have to pay for that cost, it's going to be more costly to produce bricks. Now in reality, what should really happen? Well, what should happen is probably that those people should just move away from the factory, and the factory should pay for them to help move them. So that would mean that it's more expensive for them to produce bricks for a little while, but then after they move all the people away, there's no real cost to that smoke that's just around the factory. Until we start to talk about smoke that then goes up into the ozone and then creates global warming. So you can see how externalities get to be a touchy subject really, really, really quickly, and why regulating them is such a big deal and such a big problem in economics. And so we're just kind of getting started just right down to the beginning. So this is a simple graph that gives you, really, it's quite powerful and gives you a lot of intuition for how to deal with a negative externality. And the best way to treat it is just like an increase in cost, which leads to a decrease in supply. So in the next video, we'll go over the positive externality, because I think that I've talked plenty here, and that you probably need a break to kind of get a grasp over this. So I'll see you in the next video.